So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Our speaker is Ghazal Zulfiqar, and she's an associate professor at the School of Business at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. She has a PhD in public policy from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, an MSc in development finance from the School of Oriental and African Studies in the UK, and an MBA from the Institute of Business Administration in Pakistan. She was a 2018-2019 fellow at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and she is an associate editor at the journals Organization and Gender, Work, and Organization. Ghazal, the floor is yours. And just let me know when you need me to move the slides forward.
Sure, thanks so much, Zoe. Thank you for this invitation. Really exciting to be here. Unfortunately, I have to keep my video off so that you can hear me. But do let me know if my voice breaks. I'll try maybe logging in again. So the research that I'm sharing with you today is about toilet cleaning, and I do have a background in of course, I mean, my background is public policy, but I teach at a business school now. So a lot of this research is informed by management science. So dirty people doing dirty work, the role of power and context in cleaning toilets. I've been working on this since 2016, but recently a friend and colleague from Canada and I co-wrote a paper, which it's still under review, but I'd like to share it with you. So Zoe, if we can move to the next slide. You're right. So the toilet. So why the toilet as an empirical site? In the Pakistani context, the toilet is an interesting space. It is a space where we defecate, but it's also a space where interactions between the makers of the mess and the cleaners of the mess is structured by gender, caste, class, and religious identities. So the toilet really is a seat of power if you occupy it, not if you're cleaning it. It's where socially constructed boundaries and hierarchies are really displayed in the raw. And to use Foucault, to study power in its peripheral extremities is really to see how it is embedded in a cultural context, in seemingly mundane everyday practices. Next slide. So what we have situated this analysis in is the dirty work literature, which is quite a large body of literature in management science that was informed by the anthropologist Mary Douglas's work on her. Some of you may be familiar with her work, Purity and Danger, in which she talks about anything that is out of place as being dirty. Right, so things and people and spaces can be dirty because they're just out of space with our system, our culture, our society. So that concept has been used in the dirty work literature to analyze certain occupations as being dirty because they're physically, socially, or morally tainted, right? So anywhere from sex work to gynecological nursing has been analyzed as dirty work. And it's dirty also because it affects the personal dignity of those that are involved in these tasks. So one of the occupations that's been studied as dirty is domestic work across space and time. So for instance, work done out of the Middle East and Israel shows how domestic workers deal with the derogatory gaze of the community by virtue of their occupation. And then there is work that talks about historical concerns about purity, contamination, disease, and then linking that to domestic work again and domestic abuse. So for instance, Saldania Taheda has done interesting work on the historical food relations in domestic work between domestic workers and employers. She has, if anyone's interested, she's got this great paper titled "Why Can I Not Take an Apple or a Fruit If I Wash Their Underwear?" Right? So it's that just tells you this concern with dirt and food and how that's interconnected. In the global north, so in North America and Europe, cleaning is most often done by racialized migrant workers, and there's a lot of xenophobia attached to these cultural designations around dirty work. Next slide. So in so continuing with that, the across time and space, the literature on cleaning is pretty is in agreement that the worker body is dismissed as polluted, infrahuman, subhuman, disposable, and rough, right? At the same time, there is an erotic appeal of the native cleaning woman. So the colonial, post-colonial literature has done some really interesting work on this. For instance, Anne McClintock's work, her book's titled Imperial Leather. So if some of you are familiar with Imperial Leather, is this old brand of soap, British soap. It's an interesting play on that term. If you, the book is really talks about not just dirt and hygiene, but and the comparison of the Victorian employer as the frail Madonna versus the manly, erotic, sensuous native woman, right? So, and then work, even more contemporary work in Europe and the US, talks about how cleaning women have been considered as domestic prostitutes, right? So there's this idea of the eroticization of power that is, of course, the intersecting inequalities of class, gender, race. And then dirt and disease has, this idea that dirt and disease is associated with the working classes has come at least since Victorian times and then been transported to the colonies. And it continues to stay in the colonies as well as from where it came from. So there is a fear attached to those doing this kind of work, doing cleaning work. And along with fear, then there is violence, violence being used very strategically to as boundary marker. So Barrett's work on lynchings in the US, his argument is that violence is used to secure the boundary between blackness and whiteness. And similar work has been done in India about caste-based violence and how that's used to maintain the social hegemonies of the caste system. Zoe, the next slide. So using that, we the dirty work literature, at least the one that's in management science, has really been informed by social psychology theory of SIT, or social identity theory, in which people are classified, in which or viewed as members of groups, and social phenomena is then analyzed as intergroup interactions. And SIT argues that people classify and judge others based on their group membership, which again is based on gender, race, ethnicity, and other affiliations, right? And you could be, if you're a member of the in-group, then you're with me, you're like me. If you're not, if you're an out-group member, then you're different, and we compete for status and prestige, right? And group members tend to amplify similarities between each other and amplify differences with out-group members. So using that in the dirty work literature, Ashworth and Kreiner began this, but then of course others have taken it up. They say that members of dirty work occupations are threatened workers because their identities are threatened. And so they actively work to construct positive self-images to offset that work-related stigma. Next slide. So while that is a really powerful and much used concept, the social identity and dirty work, there are critics of social identity and dirty work that say that what's been done so far has under-theorized workers' power to command social and cultural resources in order to construct these positive self-images to combat stigma. And because stigma is also related to pre-existing status categories that create durable hierarchies in society. And so what we propose is to marry SIT with status construction theory that Cecilia Ridgway had um, originally conceptualized. What she says is status is an ancient form of inequality, and the histories of the social histories of status are very important to understand why and how individuals in a particular context encounter one another within categories of social difference, and how these beliefs are created, reproduced, and interrupted or disrupted, right? So the one very important aspect of status construction theory is that it requires legitimation by both high and low status groups. So you have to accept it willingly or unwillingly that you're low status or high status. Next slide. So using that in our present context, so the research that I'm just going to share with you was done in Lahore, Pakistan, and its surrounding smaller cities. India has a very well-known caste system, and it's based on some religious concepts. That caste system is also present in Pakistan, but it's not talked about because the Hindus in Pakistan have converted, right? So we're no longer Hindus, but that caste system has remained part of our cultural heritage. And so Lahore, where I'm located, is in the province of Punjab, and Punjab's caste system is known as the Biradari system. The Biradari system is very complex, and it determines every aspect of your life, especially in the rural settings, but also those migrants into urban areas. And one of the things that the Biradari does is that it determines your occupation. So it has very structured division of labor, which intersects with class, culture, religion, and of course the occupation to create intergenerational stigma. So if you are a cobbler, then your children, your grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will remain cobblers. If you're a cleaner, then definitely there's very little social mobility you can hope for. And it also determines, of course, your access to resources. Land, for instance, is not within reach of low caste groups. And so if you're in the rural areas, then you are likely to be a sharecropper. If you've been able to migrate to the city, then you would most likely take up a cleaning job. That's the most easily available job. So over 100 years ago, the Dalits are the untouchable Hindu caste. They converted to Christianity, hoping that they would lose their untouchability status after conversion. That did not happen. So for instance, the Hindu Chura class converted and became the Christian Churas, and they remain untouchables, even though there is no religious reason for that, but that has stayed on. So the cultural context of this conversion is important. And of course, as always, women tend to get the short end of the stick. So lower caste women will be the worst off. Next slide. So our research questions were, what is the role of social identity? So pre-existing social identities and culturally embedded status beliefs in shaping toilet cleaning arrangements in Pakistan. And then given those, was there any possibility of agency for workers to shape or disrupt these hierarchies? Next slide. So as I began saying that this work was conducted beginning in 2016, it lasted until 2018. We did qualitative research using life history format with 91 women and men who clean toilets in domestic and non-domestic spaces. So non-domestic included airports, hotels, clubs, hospitals, and universities. Half of our participants were first generation rural migrants. What we asked about caste, and only half of them agreed to name their caste, which can tell you something about the stigma attached to caste. The salary range of our participants ranged from $14 per month to 130, and the minimum wage at that time was 112. So the domestic workers, of course, are part of the informal economy, so that's entirely unregulated. The non-domestic workers were usually subcontracted labor. So the next slide has a little bit of information on our participants, mostly, so half and half nearly between domestic, non-domestic. And most of our interviewees, the participants were female. We originally planned to have an only female sample, but given some of the responses we were getting, we did want to talk to a few males. And there were 53 Muslims, 35 Christians, and 3 Hindus. And you'll see a bit why the sample, the religion breakup is like that when I discuss the findings. So if you can go back to the earlier slides, sorry, Zoe, sorry. No, sorry. Sorry, so I got that wrong. We can go to the next one after the table, yeah? Yeah, so so this research was done using a critical interpretivist approach. And so because social construction is front and center in our work, it's important also to reveal the researcher's positionality. So when I began this research, I was the insider outsider. So I am originally from Pakistan, but I've lived for a decade and a half in the US. When I returned to take up this current faculty position, I was returning as a Pakistani American. So that gave me that insider outsider perspective that I think allowed me to see things that may not have been visible to me otherwise. And of course, the researcher is always in a privileged position during field work, but here that privilege was amplified by the power distance, the class distance, the educational difference, and so it was important to have a commitment not just to self-reflexivity, but also to ensure participant safety, which was not an ordinary task. Ensuring that you do not harm the participants, you do not take their silence to mean acquiescence. So those kind of things were really important. And then during the analysis and writing, again, it was important that it was the voices of the participants that drove the analysis and the writing, and not preconceived notions to the extent possible. So there were also pedagogical implications of this work, because when I started doing this work, the results were extremely alarming to me, and I teach in a private elite college. So for me, it became then a commitment to my students also. And so I involved them in the research. I teach a course called Women in Public Policy in Pakistan. And so I made that part of, for a couple of years, I made that part of the course. I trained the students, and these were undergraduate students, for this kind of qualitative research, and we did we did this work together. We can go to the next slide. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But so there was a citation at the end of the last slide, in which I've talked about this pedagogical initiative. So I don't want to go deep into it. In the Q&A, we can do this, but it was really about how I got my students involved. And that was part of that feminist consciousness raising agenda that I had during this research. So we can go to the next slide. I want to now share the findings of the research with you, which is really the crux of today. So it was clear talking to the participants that cleaning work is a temporary gig until real work comes along, especially if you're a migrant. If you're a migrant, then the easiest work to find is cleaning work. So Faisal, male janitor at a local factory, said, "I'm doing cleaning because I'm forced to." Yes, because cleaning's not actually a profession. One should engage in work that is respectable so that people meet and greet him properly. It was also clear that, that there was a lot of gendered conceptualizations around cleaning, especially domestic dirt. So a woman domestic cleaner said, "Men find this work new. You have to tell them how to do everything, how to wash the basin, how to clean the vanity, how to polish the tap. Everything has to be explained to them, while women are already trained." So it was naturalized that women just know how to clean and men have to be taught. Next slide. And then there was this constant theme of religion and religious identity. So we see, and this is corroborated by newspaper advertisements, by public sector institutions, that often have this line, "Wanted sanitary worker, only Christians need apply." And why is that? So if you, Radia, who's a woman domestic cleaner, she is saying here, "I've never seen a Muslim man working as a cleaner. Christians do this work. I'm a Muslim, my husband would never do it, though he will do gardening or security work." So clearly masculinity and the masculinity of a Muslim man would be threatened by this kind of cleaning, toilet cleaning. The other aspect is something that they call palit, so ritual impurity. If you're palit, you cannot pray. And if you're a Muslim, you have to pray 5 times a day. And if you're cleaning toilets during the day, then how do you pray, right? So that's a very culturally ingrained idea. So here's a Christian woman, Mina, who says, "I used to do this work in schools too, and they said that only I would clean the bathrooms and not the other women because they were Muslim. I said, why? Don't we pray? Why do I have to wash bathrooms? Am I not human?" So clearly the idea that you cannot pray and clean toilets at the same time, and if you're a Christian, then that's just easier for you to do or more natural for you to do. So clearly toilet cleaning involves physical, social, and moral taint. Next slide. There were also clearly systematic rituals of otherness. Food, again, was a theme that came up again and again. The Sobia here is saying the food we were given was yesterday's. We were live-ins, but for part-time workers, there's no food. If there are leftovers, they would give them to you. So the idea that fresh food's not good enough, it's only good enough for the employer and not for the toilet cleaner is really something that kept coming up again and again. And then here's Fatma, who's a Christian cleaner, and she said, "They have a separate soap for me. My dishes are separate, and I sit separately. I'm not allowed to touch the dough. Once I told her I would wash my hands and prepare the dough for her, but she said, no, don't touch the dough." And then there's Arif, who is a university janitor, who said, "The students don't look at me in the eye because they're afraid I may shake their hand." So clearly, these rituals of otherness are very systematic. Next slide. So there is this idea that physical violence is something that is a part of the cleaner and employer interaction. And so we have regular newspaper reports of torture and even murder of underage female domestics. Here we found evidence of that in many of our participant interviews. Sadia is saying, my employer blamed me for creating a rift between her husband and herself. I never crossed the line with him, but she would accuse me of ruining her marriage. I think it was her own fault. She shouldn't have been beating me in front of him. She did tell us later that he didn't like the beating. Faria said, the woman, that Faria is a young woman, she said, the woman I worked for would scold me and beat me up. My mother had taken a loan from her, so she wouldn't let me give up the job. When I went home, I showed my bruised hands and feet to my sister-in-law, who told my brother. That was when my family finally came to get me. This idea, debt bondage is another important theme here. Parents that are very, very poor parents who are dealing with daily hunger leave their underage daughter often with employers that will give them a bulk loan. So something like $500 is a huge amount of money here. And if you get that amount of money and you get a young child worker, you don't have to pay her salary. You can just keep, that's a form of repayment from the family. So in that case, even if abuse is revealed to the family, they cannot really or do not bring their child back because there's no way to repay that money. There's also the ever-lurking threat of sexual abuse. We didn't have a lot of participants admitting that they were abused. They talked about how they know someone who was abused, but there were a few young women who talked about how they were constantly threatened by the male members of the household or by other male employees like the cook or the driver. And then they were afraid to report this because they felt very sure, they were very certain that they would be punished by the female employer or blamed for the tension. Next slide. Another very systematic process that we heard of and we saw was how the cleaners are constantly accused of crimes. So in the kotis, which are mansions, Bushra is telling us, where the women have a lot of jewelry and other things lying around, they often ditch us on salary day, accusing us of having stolen from them. They tell us this was missing and this has got missing. The Arif, who's the janitor at the university, said, if a student blames me of stealing, whether or not I'm guilty, my salary and job are gone. I'm afraid of this. This is the worst that can happen to me. So he was not the only one who told us about this. Here's a female janitor who also said, we never leave without getting checked because the girls complain that they have lost this or that, or accuse us of taking their food. And there were others. There's only so much that I can show you, but this was backed by many other participants. Next slide. So this social violence was accompanied by other forms of social violence. Sabrina, who is a Christian cleaner, told us, in our church, we received classes on patience and perseverance. Father told us to be patient, to tolerate everything, and to control our anger. We learned to bear everything. We face a lot of disrespect. Sometimes we even begin to cry, but still we bear it all. And then Faisal, the janitor at the local factory, he told us how he was fired. An officer from another department asked me to clean his toilet. I was busy with my own work, so I didn't do what he asked. I was fired because the officer was influential. My supervisors didn't listen to me. Next slide. So why do people do this work if it is so horrible? Well, first of all, for young rural migrants, sometimes it's lack of choice. So Sobia told us, when I was 9, my family told me I was going to Lahore to visit my cousin, but my cousin dropped me to the house where I was supposed to work. I did not know that I would have to work and live with these people night and day. I was very scared. And then there are some happier stories. So there's the story of Rabina, who also came when she was 9. She was brought by her aunt to Lahore, and she came from a village so small that it doesn't even show up on the map. And when she saw Lahore, she was astounded. She said, "I'd never seen an airplane. I'd never seen so much traffic and buildings." And she wanted to stay, but she quickly got tired of the work. Now Rubina is in her early 20s, and she is working towards her high school degree and is hoping to get an office job. Her sisters, like her, came and did cleaning work, but then they put themselves to school and then college, and now are working as midwives in a private hospital. So Rubina says that, yes, this work has stigma and we don't like doing it, but it's much better than the back-breaking work that is sharecropping. So, but when older participants insisted that the last thing they wanted was for their children to do this kind of work, some of them admitted that their daughters were doing this work, but this wasn't out of choice. It was because they couldn't afford to put them in school or get them better jobs. So next slide. So we can now move to the discussion of these findings. So the theoretical contributions here, going back to where we started: dirty work, social identity theory, and status. Here, when we bring in the role of context, then we can see that the hierarchies of the caste system, that is the biradri, are reproduced in cleaning work through the rituals of otherness, through the rituals of eating, sitting, and cleaning. So sitting, again, cleaners are not allowed to sit at the same level as the employers. So if you're sitting on a couch, then your cleaner will sit on the floor, eat on the floor, sleep on the floor. So the normalization of these hierarchies, really, and these practices of untouchability is what we find is protecting these privileged state spaces from the contamination and the of the other, that is the cleaner. And in these hierarchies, clearly the bottom of the pole is the low class, low caste Christian woman. And the reason is because her social history of being the untouchable Hindu refuses erasure. So she remains that untouchable low caste class woman who's fit only to clean toilets. And so the kind of discourse that the participants reported, for instance, the church teaching forbearance and silence and acceptance, is only serving to cement these boundaries further and to maintain the status difference. The violence, the everydayness of violence, and the physical and social accusations of of crime are another means of validating the power that is inherent in these arrangements and preserving the social order. Next slide. So the other question we had was the role of agency in constructing positive self-images. But again, we felt that Ashworth and Kreiner did not take into account the role of power and context when they said that threatened workers are able to construct positive self-images. First of all, being able to question the notion of untouchability is again something that requires a certain degree of power. We did not see too many people. So there was Mina, who said, "Am I not human? Do I not praise?" That's clearly questioning the status quo, but that didn't come through in a lot of our interviews. And again, the church teachings are diminishing any agency that the worker could have. We didn't see occupational pride being exhibited anywhere, which is required if you want to construct that positive self-image of for instance, works done on blue-collar workers, construction workers in the UK shows how that, we're manly men. So that trying to bring up the hypermasculinity in construction work, it helps to build that a positive self-image. None of that was evident here. And then there is, of course, even when young people don't want to leave this work because of debt bondage, they are not allowed to, even by their own families. There is, of course, some degree of agency here, being able to migrate and from the villages to the cities means that you are breaking through biradari determined occupational demarcations, but only to an extent. And so there is limited agency there. And the last slide's about the policy implications. So toilet cleaning is by and large invisible work everywhere. And certainly here, I have been involved in the Domestic Worker Act. There were policy consultations prior to the act being passed. This is the first act that has been passed in the country, the Punjab Domestic Worker Act. But it remains unimplemented. And the reason for that is anyone's guess. So after reading this, after this research, it's clear that what this implementation will require will be to disrupt historically rooted.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that Punjab Domestic Worker Act is?
Sure. So, and the reason the Punjab Domestic Worker Act is what I bring up is because the domestic workers are the most marginalized of cleaners, right? Because they're in an entirely unregulated sector. So the Domestic Worker Act is giving so it's stipulating some labor rights for the workers that involves, for instance, an 8-hour workday, food, fresh food being given to the worker, and linking it to the prohibition of child labor. The child labor is, of course, banned in Pakistan, but this is an unregulated sector, and that's why child labor is very much a part of domestic work here. So this act also emphasizes that no child can do domestic work. So those are some of the stipulations. Yeah. But it remains, as I said, unimplemented, and at this point at least. And that would, so I'm happy to talk more about the policy implications, but as far as my slides are concerned, I'm all done. Should I try turning my video on and then I'll...
Sure, we can do that. See if that works, and happy to take questions, comments from the audience.
If my voice breaks, let me know.
I'll let you know. Ghazal, I had a question about just the broader policy implications. So I think one of the big issues is that, when it's a policy around people who are at the very bottom of the totem pole in terms of class, that they have very little political power. So it's often very difficult to pass policy in this area because the powers that be have vested interests in opposing it. Have there been like organizing activities in Pakistan to kind of raise awareness or build solidarity among these groups? So kind of what else is being done to try to push this Domestic Worker Act towards being implemented?
Right. So that has two aspects to that. So the Domestic Worker Act came out of advocacy work. Nationally, but there's always a global element. So, for instance, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, has a lot to do with forcing the provincial labor ministry to pass this act. There's also the Global Domestic Worker Alliance. Which is so in the US, I think it's called the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Here in Pakistan, interestingly, the first ever union of domestic workers was registered in Lahore. And I did research on their work. It is a registered union, but it lacks teeth. So I tried to do, I also study informal women workers advocacy network. So I looked at that, but it lacks teeth again. And then they are the ones who organize, for instance, this policy consultations that I attended. But again, it's just this complete lack of understanding of the power hierarchy. So I remember in the during the policy consultation, everyone was at the table. There were unions, there were NGOs, there was the women's ministry, the labor ministry. I, as an academic, guess who was missing? The domestic workers. And so, I remember asking them, well, where are they? And they said, oh, they couldn't get off work, but you're a woman, you understand their issues, so why don't you represent them, right? So that kind of complete lack of understanding these power hierarchies.
If I could sort of comment and follow up on that, it sounds like all what you're describing is what the employers want are people in a subordinate status. So that's kind of part of what the demand is. And it was sort of occurring to me, I don't know what the technology is of these toilets and so on, whether they're flush toilets or older things, but it almost occurs to me that even if there was newer technologies that would make less use of labor, these employers are basically wanting people to be in a subordinate status. That's kind of part of what's at stake. And what actually came to mind, there's the famous passage in Hegel about the lord-slave relationship, and the slave has power in the sense that the Lord wants somebody to sort of push around. So I was wondering about that dimension of this, that what is being demanded here is really to somebody to be in a subordinate status, not just to sort of maintain cleanliness. Is that
right?
A dimension of?
Yeah, so there are flush toilet. Again, the kind of toilets that you get to use is also determined by your status. So a hole in the ground is what you get if you're the cleaner, and a flush toilet is what you get if you're a middle class or upper middle class person, right? But toilets get cleaned every single day here in Pakistan, right? So again, this notion of purity and danger. So you have, and it just reminds me again and again of Mary Douglas's work on how impurity is danger, and we need to stay clean. So yeah, so again, the policy implication is that the policymakers need someone to clean their toilets. The NGO and advocacy workers also need someone to clean their toilets. And that's what I noticed during the consultation. Sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, yeah, I was wondering if there's sort of a tradition of wanting to maintain the sort of non-flush toilets. I saw this Bollywood movie once on a flight to India where it was supposed to be a comedy, but the theme was that the fiance, the bride, wanted to use a flush toilet, but the husband's father wouldn't let them. So they were always finding these ways to sneak the bride to a flush toilet to evade the father wanting to maintain their traditional uses. This sounds familiar to you, so I'm just wondering if there's this tradition, and part of it is they want to have these people there that are having in the subordinate status. There's sort of this tradition of that.
Yeah, so I've heard about that. I've heard about that. Is it the movie called The Toilet or Toilet? It did get very, very popular.
I can't remember. It was very funny. It was a hilarious movie. All the things, the ways they found, she would board trains that were passing through so she could use the toilet during the 5-minute train stop and all this. But I can't remember the name of the movie. It was set in India. It wasn't in Pakistan, but it was.
Yeah, we share a lot of our traditions and crazy ideas. So again, it depends, right? How long ago were you in a village? So for instance, Rubina, who I mentioned here, she told me that they don't have a toilet at home in their village. And I said, why is that? Can you not save up to construct a toilet? And she said, no, my mom says that having a toilet in the home is dirty. So it's cleaner to go in the bush than to have a toilet at home. So again, there are cultural differences, and it depends on, context, and again, class, caste, and all of these hierarchies determine the culture.
Dr. Ghazal, I have a question. So you noted that that there is a very limited agency amongst these workers. So and in order to implement the Punjab Domestic Worker Act, one would need to break through the shackles of the Biradari system. So I was wondering, what's your opinion on the role of education? Would educating Pakistani children from the school level about the abuses that take place in this kind of work, would that be facilitative, or would that help in raising consciousness of the rights of these domestic workers? Would that perhaps, maybe not now, but maybe in several years or maybe even decades, can that, I mean, I mean, would that help in turning the tide and helping these workers get their rights?
Yes, so thank you for asking that question. Can you hear me? Because okay, great. So the pedagogical intervention that that I wrote about, that I had a slide on, that I didn't stay on, was an attempt to see what happens when you have this kind of consciousness raising through interactive work with students. And students, what I asked them to do was to write a reflective essay on their relationship with the toilet. I asked them certain questions. I said, do you know who cleans your toilet, why they clean it, where do they go when they need to go? And are they allowed to use your, and so so they wrote these fascinating, absolutely fascinating accounts, and especially those with rural backgrounds. They said things that we are large landowners and we can ask anyone in the village to come in and clean our toilet because everyone is our servant. And so those kind of stories didn't come up so much in the cities, where things were a lot more modest, but still there were questions, and there was a lot that students had around cleanliness. The toilet has to be absolutely clean or I won't use it, and no one can use my toilet except me or maybe my family members, right? So those reflections were part one of the project. Part two was to do a life history interview of a cleaner. And then part three was to do an analysis of the policy implications that came out of that research. And part four was dissemination. So we held seminars in the university. We also shared our findings with the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. And then we did a survey. So when I was writing this paper that came out earlier this year, we did a survey of students that had taken my course a few years ago, and some of them responded, and the responses were wonderful because they said it has changed our relationship with toilets and toilet cleaners. And we've recently, a year ago, we had janitorial protests around Easter because the cleaners were not paid before Easter their monthly salary, and a lot of students joined the protest. And during the follow-up survey, several students told me that this came out because of how they felt their eyes had been opened with that coursework. So yeah, I absolutely feel, and I think that this needs to be done a lot earlier than a university. So thank you for that.
Ghazal, thank you for your presentation. Great to see some of these interesting structural issues and dynamics documented. You certainly hear about these things anecdotally from many different contexts, but just having this documented is really nice. But speaking of different contexts, I was wondering if you've had the opportunity to study other states or maybe even other countries where domestic workers are very common. And as a result, you might get some variation in some of these power dynamics, or perhaps the relevance of a toilet specifically as part of toilet cleaning as part of domestic work. And whether you might gain some insights on how important some of these drivers are in the resulting outcome of, in this particular case, toilet cleaning and the welfare of toilet cleaners.
Thank you. Great question. So first of all, I always go back to my own country, my own other country, which is the US, right? So things here in the US aren't all that great either for domestic workers. If you just look at legislation, the 1930s labor laws specifically excluded domestic workers and farm workers because for obvious reason if you think about the 30s. So it's been an uphill battle to get legislative cover. Even something like minimum wage for domestic workers is so hard to get for a cleaner specifically in the US, and many of the cleaners are migrants. They don't have their papers, and so it's just so easy to exploit. And this idea of sexual harassment is also something that is very, very prevalent. There are actually maid services right now in the US that you can call that are only partially there to clean. They're also to serve the mail. Right? So in other ways. And so this, what I described is very particular to Pakistan, and similar work has been done in India and Bangladesh, but there are different ways of exploitation in other parts of the world. The COVID has shown us, the pandemic has shown us how vulnerable are cleaners. So the New York Times has run several features on migrant workers that have been forced to clean and how they have been endangered by people who asked them to clean, not telling them that the house had, was infected, and or just putting the plug on their salaries. And that happened across the board. It happened here in Pakistan, but it happened all over the world. So these structures are there. It's just the dynamics may be slightly different in a different geography. Any other questions? All right. Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Last call for questions. If anyone has them, graduate students, any questions? You're welcome to send me a chat privately if you have a question you want to raise. Okay.
All right.
In that case, Dr. Zulfiqar has offered to stick around for a little while if anybody has any extra questions or wants to stay afterwards and chat. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks Dr. Zulfiqar for your really interesting talk. And I'm so glad that the connection worked out really well. And once we got started, we had no connection issues. So that's a big win for all of us today. This is our last seminar of the academic year. I look forward to seeing all of you at our seminars in the fall, which look like they're going to be in person if all goes to plan. So and I think we'll also have almost certainly have a kind of a hybrid option as well for people to join remotely, since we have the technology for that. So thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day.